Senator Bates, SB 259.
Good morning, Chairman Hertzberg and members, and I want to say thank you for the opportunity to present Senate Bill 259. We good?
We're good.
I'd like to start by accepting the committee amendment that states that the Legislative Analyst's Office, rather than the Board of Equalization, shall report to the legislature no later than January 1st, 2021, regarding the economic impact of the bill. I'm pleased to be here today with Howard Jarvis Taxpayer Association, the California Business Roundtable, California Business Properties Association, and the California Chamber of Commerce, all supporting SB 259. It alters the definition of change of ownership in the Revenue and Tax Code for purposes of determining the property tax-based value of commercial property. Current law allows for a property to be reassessed if a majority of the ownership changes hands. SB 259 states that if 90% of the ownership interest changes hands within any 3-year period, that the property will be reassessed. SB 259 was introduced to correct an outdated interpretation of change of ownership that we believe has been the subject of multiple instances of illegitimate tax evasion. You know the prime example, members. A hotel in Santa Monica was purchased and the transaction was structured so that no single entity owned a 50% majority share of the property, despite the fact that 100% of the ownership of the hotel did change hands. Property was not reassessed, and this resulted in a tax loss to the county. While the tax code and tax law are complex, this bill is fairly simple. The Board of Equalization estimates that the change will result in approximately $26 million in additional property tax revenue. Former Assemblyman Tom Amiano carried similar legislation to address the problem. SB 259 will fix the specific problem that has been identified. Here as a technical resource for the committee is Rosemarie Kinney. Rosemarie, an analyst with the Board of Equalization, and I need to make it clear the Board of Equalization has no position on SB 259. I'm also joined by Rob Lapsley, the president of the California Business Roundtable, and David Wolf from the Howard Jarvis Taxpayers Association. And to add support, we also have Matthew Hargrove from the California Business Properties Association. And my witnesses are here.
Mr. Chairman, good morning. Rob Lapsley, California Business Roundtable. Just wanted to quickly provide a little bit of background. When this issue came up, the Roundtable joined with the Howard Jarvis Taxpayers Association and many, many other companies throughout California on what embarked to be a 6-month process to try and develop language on what we thought looked like a very legitimate issue to address what type of complex transaction this was. And embarking on that journey and working with the experts at the Board of Equalization and others, this language represents a very strong effort to be able to do what's right and address something that should be addressed. They're complex. They don't happen often, which is why the revenue piece is not that large. But if it does happen, then it needed to be fixed. And so we are pleased that we could partner with Howard Jarvis on that, and we appreciate the Senator's leadership to bring it before you today.
Thank you.
Mr. Chairman, members, good morning and Happy New Year. David Wolf with the Howard Jarvis Taxpayers Association, and we're in support. I would obviously echo all the points of Mr. Lapsley in terms of the Business Roundtable's rationale for supporting the bill, but just a simple clarifying point, if I might. The bill is being interpreted by some in the media and elsewhere as making a change to Proposition 13. And just to stress, this bill does not change Prop 13, which is enshrined in the Constitution. It merely addresses how the law is to be implemented in statute. We've always made it clear that property owners should pay the property taxes required of them under current law, and that we stand willing to fix any legitimate abuse that may arise regarding such issues as change of ownership. If complete control of a property changes, such as under the Michael Dell situation, that property should be reassessed. It really is that simple, and I'd ask for an aye vote.
Before further testimony, I'd like to establish quorum. Please, Secretary, call the roll.
Hertzberg.
Here.
Hertzberg present. Nguyen. Bell. Here. Bell present. Hernandez. Hernandez present. Lara. Morlock. Morlock present. Pavley.
We have quorum. Please, okay, it makes you question if anybody knows. You know, Senator, you mentioned $26 million. Seems to me, you mean to tell me that and who did this analysis to come up with $26 million? That's an annual number, I'm assuming.
Yes, Board of Equalization gave us.
Board of Eq did that? And does anybody have a basis, anybody from the Board of Eq, to give us a little bit of insight in how they got that number? Because it seems to me that the number would probably be bigger. It's a pretty conservative approach somebody took. The Board of Eq?
Yes,
Oh, good.
Rosemary Kinney with the Board of Equalization.
Thank you. Can you tell us how you got to that number?
How we got to that number is we had to estimate the assessed value of property owned by a legal entity. That is, we estimated it to be,
Is this the hotel?
no,
Oh, it's just-
all property in California owned by a legal entity. So we took that total of known assessed value.
Yeah.
We increased it by the 4R Act, which is our estimate that legal entity properties are assessed at 71% of fair market value. So we bumped that up to get a total increase. If all legal entity owned property was reassessed, would be $264 billion. Then we estimated that 1% of that would be affected by this bill, and it is an estimate.
It's just, and is there any, just real quickly, do you have a basis for that estimate beyond just being conservative?
Just an assumption, no.
Okay, just an assumption.
Correct.
Go ahead. Tell us what else you want to tell us. Anything else?
That's it.
Okay.
Mr. Chair and members, Matthew Harga with the California Business Properties Association. Just shed a little light on why that number is probably as small as it is. These are not that common transactions. And within the commercial real estate world, we want to be reassessed as soon as possible. As soon as we get reassessed, we can share the taxes with the tenants that we have in our buildings. So this is a misconception that property owners don't want to be reassessed. We actually want to be reassessed as quick as possible.
Well, yeah, but it depends upon the nature of the property. You know, I mean, I spent a lot of years practicing real estate law, and my judgment is, and wrote some books on real estate law, and my judgment is that that's a impish number because not all properties, certainly with respect to the folks that you represent, they're landlords, right? And their business is renting. But in California, a lot of folks own their own property, and they go to their lawyers and do everything humanly possible to reduce that number. And if there's a downturn, there's a whole industry of lawyers who work on contingency cases that fight that number because the impact is so big to business owners. So that's why I think the number would be much larger than $26 million if this became the law. So just a thought. Share it with you. Go ahead. Anything further?
No, sir.
Opposition? Any opposition to the measure?
Mr. Chair and members, Tim Cromartie on behalf of the League of California Cities in support of the bill.
Support of the measure. Okay. I apologize. I said any other in support? Opposition?
Mr. Chair, members, Lenny Goldberg, California Tax Reform Association. I've worked on this issue longer than I can ever admit to, probably. And there are two reasons why this number is so small. One is the bill barely does anything with regard to closing the loophole. If you want to use the loophole, this bill makes virtually no difference. The second reason the number is so small is let me just leave it at that, it really makes very little difference with regard to being able to avoid change of ownership. Many years ago, when these bills started happening and we said, hey, 100% change of ownership should be a change of ownership, the business community, actually that was my second reason. The second reason it's so small is the business community's here and they know it's going to be small, they know it's all avoidable. So we said 100% change of ownership should be change of ownership, But the law is really 50% cumulative change of ownership. So 20 years ago, Senator Quentin Kopp, independent senator, had a bill that said 50% cumulative change of ownership, rebuttable presumption for publicly traded corporations for shares of stock, and a huge amount of property in California, very high-value property, is owned by real estate investment trusts, which you may know from being a real estate lawyer. And those real estate investment trusts, some of them are privately held, many of them are publicly traded. So we're exempting huge amounts of property here from any change of ownership law. So when we said, let's look at this, there was a bill, we amended a bill to say, let's bring everybody back to the table and have a discussion about whether change of ownership law can be seriously reformed. You actually have expressed that view, that we can seriously reform change of ownership. I believe that if you actually did it right, probably business would object, it would be intrusive and very, very difficult to track privately held REITs and how they change ownership and all that. But at least we'd have the discussion. Here, what we have is the business community coming forward and saying, let's put lipstick on a pig. I totally appreciate that Senator Bates and the business folks understand that the system is broken. But as your analysis points out, if the three of us were to buy a property but leave the 11% share until after 3 years and buy it out, there's no change of ownership. There's new law in here that says we're never going to look at stock transactions, and the normal function of a stock exchange shall not be considered. Well, many, many buyouts of companies occur through the accumulation of stock. So what we've set up is a system for a great deal of new litigation. Is this a buyout, which we're supposedly picking up, or is it the normal functions of a stock exchange? It also basically says if that cumulative change didn't take place over the 3 years, it never takes place. So we appreciate the recognition that the system is broken, but this bill puts a gloss as if we were doing something, which is why business supports it, and most of us who've looked for reform oppose it. And I think that the solution here would be to do what was called split roll when we did it, which is set up a little committee to discuss the ways in which the law is broken and have a full-fledged, really wide-open discussion of what should happen about, is change of ownership law workable in any form, or are there other changes that we should consider? Otherwise, moving this bill is a pretense that we've done something, and actually in some ways, for example, the shares of stock, the cumulative ownership, makes things worse. So we urge you to reject this bill.
Any others in opposition? Questions from the members? Ms. Goldberg, why don't you stay here for a second? It is a broad public policy challenge that we face in a democracy, that the perfect is the enemy of the good. If you were to tell Senator Bell that he gets $26 million more to pay salaries to keep some of those regional centers open, it's not an insignificant measure. Is it, in your judgment, from a public policy perspective, you're saying, well, it's really kind of taking a look at this thing and only solving a very small part of the problem. Well, this doesn't bind future legislators. It doesn't bind other members to do different things. It doesn't, when you look at the law, Prop 30 was passed. People can say, well, was that a good thing or a bad thing to avoid the downturn of funding for folks? But it had a short fuse on it. Was it enough money? What was the nature of it? The question is this a problem? Are you not challenging the entirety of it? Okay, fair, I get your argument. But if we can pull together a coalition that moves the ball and that actually puts money, what if we dedicated this to developmentally disabled, or dedicated to the University of California for scholarships for kids or something like that, this delta of this money? I'm not suggesting we do it. My only suggestion is 26 million, which I think is impish in the number, is not a small number to folks. So it's a move in the right direction. It's a community that has not acknowledged any movement so far, and take what you can take and keep up the fight. I know you've been fighting a long time. I'm going to give you credit for it. But it is what it is.
May I
like to hear it,
respond?
of course.
Sure. I worked in this building for many, many years. I've always felt that the perfect is the enemy of the good, that there's things you get done, you try to move the ball forward. This does not move the ball forward. It moves it backwards. It exempts a huge category of property. It basically puts a gloss that there's change when there's no change. Now, I don't believe the 26 million will be available, and that is because it's so easy to avoid it if you want to avoid it. Now, I would say, and I've looked at zillions of properties through the mapping and analysis we've done, the majority of properties, this is true, are at market value or within 15% of it. But what you have are major properties pre-2000, mostly in land value, and so we could have an empirical discussion and say, who are we picking up here, there, and everywhere? If somebody wants to play the loophole game, this bill does not close it. But what it does do is make sure that Chevron's property will still be assessed at 1975 values, no matter. This is not the enemy of the good. This is not a good bill. It adds new exemptions. It puts a gloss on a system that's broken. And I really would urge, and I think that the solution here is to say, let's set up a broad-based discussion. I'm happy to, I've had many discussions with business folks over the years about, is there a sensible change that is not really continues the loophole, but looks like it's doing something. That's bad policy. We know that from around here, where you look like you're doing something and you're not doing anything.
The only thing I would suggest to you, just one final point, Senator Nguyen, you wanted to comment? Yeah, the only comment is this. There's a distinction in the real estate world that I don't think your argument recognizes. There are people that are in the business of real estate, as was mentioned by the other folks, where you're basically through a triple net lease or a base year lease, you're just passing it on. So the analysis is, because even though the big owner owns all this property, they're just in the business of renting. So what you're really doing is taking the small business people, 78% of all people in California work for companies that are 10 employees or less, and you're contractually imposing that obligation. In this situation, the distinction I see is there's a single owner who's taking advantage of the law, and it inures to the benefit of the Dell family in the Miramar property in Santa Monica, or others that particularly own it, as opposed to the little person, as opposed to the small business person. And it's fundamental distinction, and by lopping together all of this stuff in one big play, I think ignores the underlying business architecture of what this is about. But you can respond, but let's Senator Nguyen. I just wanted to share that thought with the committee.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. I just have a question to Mr. Goldberg. The current bill, would you say that it does, if it wasn't existent and the Dell family, this would not have happened?
Oh, it could easily have happened.
But this is 90%. This is, the Dell family, we're talking about moving it, but we're looking, this is actually a fix that is 90% of the movement of the property. And that's what happened. They took advantage of something and did 50%. I see this legislation as, if it had existed, the Dell family would not be able to pull that.
They took 100%. And the way they took the law right now, and the reason the law is pretty absurd, is that it says you have to take 50 plus 1% of a property. So, Senator Nguyen, if you and I were to each buy 50% of a property and take 100%, it would not be a change of ownership and would not be reassessed. So Michael Dell divided up the shares. Now, in his case, if the previous owner had held, if they had just made a side agreement to say we're going to buy 89% of the shares, and the previous owner will buy you out 3 years later. Now, in real estate, there are all kinds of complicated transactions where you can say, we'll pay you out and take ownership number of years. From the rents in this property, we will pay you until the property is, we're amortizing that.
That happened? Because I've never seen it happen.
Where people
You
hold.
want to buy a piece of property and you want it done.
Well, partnerships, actually, partnerships, limited liability companies, partners are coming and going all the time.
Have you ever seen it? Because I never.
Yeah, their partners change all the time. Limited liability companies, you have several owners, partners change all the time. So Michael Dell could have structured his deal in this case to avoid change of ownership. But for the most part, what you have is a constant coming and going of partners, a constant coming and going of, it's about capitalization. It's not about avoiding the tax. It's about the capitalization of the company. I want to sell my share to somebody else. So you have constant changing, you have cumulative changes of ownership that occur, and no reassessment.
Anything further from the members? Senator Morlock?
Mr. Wolf, maybe could you respond to the argument about the change in ownership of stock?
Mr. Morlock, thank you for the question. Mr. Lapsley, would you like to perhaps address that?
So, again, these are very complex transactions, and the issue on the stock piece was examined from multiple angles, again, over a 6-month process. We also actually took a very long look at what happens with family-based transactions. Those who have long histories of families have very sensitive issues when it comes to these types of transactions. And the language that's represented in here, again, reflects the best effort in what needed to be done. And when it comes to the stock transactions, and I think actually, again, the Board of Equalization, Mr. Morlock can address this as well, does not apply in a lot of these cases. So if Board of Equalization would like to address that too, but that is the discussion that took place. And again, to look at the entirety of these pieces, when the first transaction like this came to light, Mr. Goldberg said he's looked at many, but there hasn't been that many in our research that we have found with this type of approach, which is why we felt it was the best thing to do to say, now that we understood what was being done, that it was important to address. And this has never taken place before. And again, especially when it comes to trying to deal with the change of ownership pieces around Prop 13. So it was very, very complex to get through that. And again, looking at how we can balance those pieces. So we appreciate the committee's deliberation on this, because we understand.
Thank you.
That's a big issue.
Good to close, Senator.
Yes, thank you. I think I'd like to just focus us for a moment on what President Obama focused on in his presentation last night regarding protecting small businesses in our nation, the economic engine of our nation. And I will say in the 36th Senate District, as I traveled during the interim and had many meetings with small business, this was a topic of top priority regarding the way commercial property would be assessed going forward. And since Mr. Goldberg brought up the split roll issue, that is at the base of this. This bill is to correct gaming the system and putting in jeopardy all of the small business-owned properties, commercial properties, through a split roll, which is what the California Tax Reform Committee is advocating. And we know that will have a myriad of problems, too. This bill is to address one violation, a huge one that we all are now aware of. It wasn't intended to address every single thing that's wrong with our tax system, but closing this loophole is an important one, and certainly a protection for our local governments or state governments that depend on those property taxes, and on the protections that Prop 13 brought to our state in terms of the assessment of property at both levels. So I urge support of this bill. If we need to do some more tweaking of it. In certain areas, we're certainly open to that, but I think it's vital in terms of going forward and ensuring that we do have the integrity of Prop 13 going forward. Committee amendments, yes.
Accept the committee amendments to study the revenue effects, as we discussed, of the bill and the LAO to report on its economic impact.
Yes.
Yep. Is there a motion on this measure? Moved by Senator Morlock. Secretary, call the roll.
Hertzberg.
Aye.
Hertzberg, aye. Wynn. Wynn, aye. Bell. Bell, aye. Hernandez. Hernandez, aye. Laura. Morlock. Morlock, aye. Pavley. You've got 5-0, right?
5-0, that's it? Is anybody else? Everybody's voted? Oh, we're waiting for, let's keep the roll open for Senator Laura. Thank you very much.
Thank
got,
you for the debate.
Thank you so much, Senator.